Education. And not seeing anything else in the inbox and not seeing anyone dialed in. That concludes public comment number 1.
Thanks, Jessica. That moves us to item number 3, approval of commission meeting minutes from the August 13th, 2021 meeting. Hopefully you've had a chance to review those. If so, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Member Jensen. I'd move to approve the minutes as presented.
We have a motion to approve the minutes. Do we have a second?
This is Paul, second.
Motion from Dave, second by Paul. Any questions about the minutes? If not, our method of voting that we've been using all along because of Zoom is to just indicate if you oppose or wish to abstain from approval of the minutes. Are there any opposing votes or abstentions?
No.
Hearing none, minutes are adopted. Item number 4, Nevada Department of Education update. The Commission on School Funding will receive an update on the progress made by the Nevada Department of Education.
Okay, so we're going to get an update on the funding, on the progress, and there has been no progress, and I'll tell you why. Because they have not turned in the data from the local schools, and that's a requirement under the law.
Since the last meeting, as well as responses to recent requests from the Commission for information and clarification. That will be presented by Heidi Hartz, Deputy Superintendent for Student Investment. Heidi?
Let's hear it.
Good morning, Chair Hobbs. This is State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Joan Ebert. I would like to formally thank you for your willingness to serve as chair on the Commission for School Funding. We are honored to have worked with you for the last 2 years in this very important work for our state. Everyone knows your background. Everyone appreciates your leadership. And I specifically want to thank you for, after being asked, you said you agreed. And so we're thankful to have you lead this work. With that, we will turn the time over to Heidi Hartz.
Thank you and good morning to the members of the Commission. For the record, Heidi Hartz. I serve as the Deputy Superintendent of our Student Investment Division at the Department of Education. With respect to our update from the work that we have been engaged in since our last meeting, I do want to share with you that we have updated a summary of the recommendations that were developed by the Commission on School Funding and provided to the governor and the legislature, both by the July 2020 deadline, as well as subsequent recommendations that were put forward in January and April of 2022. That summary document has been posted on the website as part of this agenda, and we will move forward with posting it on the NDE website under the link for the Commission on School Funding. The document provides a brief summary of each recommendation and then the action that was taken as a result of the 2021 legislative session. And as a point of reference, we also identified the items that were included in the letter of intent that was submitted to the Department of Education and asked the Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding to look at some very specific topics and report back to the Interim Finance Committee by the end of, I believe it's July 2022. The Department of Education has continued to collaborate with school districts and charter schools to develop business rules specific to the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. Most recently, we have received input through a working group and then from a larger group of CFOs with respect to revisions to the chart of accounts that are used for tracking expenditures across all school districts and the charter schools and the business rules that clarify those changes. We hope to have those finalized within the next week so that we can send those out to the school districts and the charter schools. We're also working on finalizing the reporting requirements for the October 1 reporting that's included or was initially included in Senate Bill 543, recognizing that in our first year of implementation and with delayed notification to school districts and schools, we may not be able to do or to receive the high quality of data or information that we can acquire or prepare in future years when we have more experience and again, more feedback from our schools and school districts about the reporting requirements and how best to capture that information without unnecessarily increasing the workload. Staff are also beginning to develop regulations as prescribed in NRS specific to the various adjustments included in the pupil-centered funding plan. That work will begin in late September and will include some public hearings that coincide with the next State Board of Education meeting. As requested, we have met with representatives from APA and EK Consultants. Both have indicated their willingness to have a meeting to discuss the differences included in their proposed recommendations and methodologies or education cost index. That meeting will be held between all of the groups together, as well as with the Department of Education and representatives from the Governor's Finance Office later this month. As we have had preliminary conversations, particularly with APA, they have indicated that one of the decision points that will be necessary for the Commission on School Funding to confirm its intent is specifically what is the intent of the adjustment, because the methodology should support the intended output or outcome of the adjustment. They also noted that it will be important to come up with or continue with a single methodology rather than trying to pull parts and pieces from different methodologies that may not work in conjunction with each other. The department has also included in the materials for today's meeting and posted on the website a timeline that identifies the tasks for the Commission on School Funding for the current biennium, and identifies the key points of points in time when tasks must be completed. For example, all of the items that were included in the letter of intent from the legislature are to be reported back to the Interim Finance Committee by August of 2022. Recommendations moving forward from the Commission on School Funding will go to the Legislative Committee on Education, which has historically met between the months of January and June of the interim year. And then, of course, due to legislative action during the 2021 legislative session, the Commission will not be able to hold formal meetings after September 30th of 2022 until July 1st following the next legislative session. With that, Mr. Chair, we would be happy to answer any questions that you have about the work that the department has been engaged in that's not yet included on this agenda.
Heidi, just something that you just commented about, I think some clarity, maybe just for me, but I think you may have covered it. So the items that we'll be dealing with, let's use item 5 and 6 on today's agenda as examples, things I think we can probably work through and make a recommendation about. Those would go into a report that we would then file with the state in advance of the next legislative session for those adjustments to be included the next go around. Is that our understanding?
So the recommendations specific to the methodology for budgeting for auxiliary services is an item that was requested by the members of the money committees during the 2021 session. So those recommendations would go in response to the letter of intent, which is due to the Interim Finance Committee in August of 2022.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Heidi? Paul?
Thanks, Chair Hobb. Got to get used to saying that. I just actually wanted to thank Superintendent Ebert and Ms. Hartz for their outreach to the school districts and their collaboration on a number of issues, grant issues, reporting and accountability. I really appreciate that. I wanted to make sure I publicly thanked their efforts. I know it's not easy coordinating all the 17 school districts to get together, and probably could be a little bit frustrating to get the diversification of opinions because we all think we're right. But it's been outstanding. I appreciate it, and I just wanted to get on record as publicly showing my appreciation and just saying thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to take a moment to the comments that Superintendent Ebert made, certainly very kind. I hope it's not one of those cases where you get what you pay for. I think I've expressed to some of you that the past couple of years spent with working with this group of people, each of you, as well as the NDE staff, it's certainly been a learning experience for me. I've served on a number of these commissions in the past to deal with different matters of taxation or debt management or debt issuance, those kinds of things. And you know, it's pretty straightforward algebraic type of stuff with a little bit of a political twist to it. But I don't know that I've ever worked with a group of people, both those on the commission and those in the Department of Ed, that are so passionate and dedicated to one of the most important causes that we have in the entire state. And it really opened my eyes over the past couple of years, and it's one of the things that really incentivized me to want to continue forward with that next step, a very important step, and that's, you know, hopefully taking care of some of the other technicalities that we may have with the formula and monitoring. I'm certainly not trying to underemphasize the importance of that, but the funding element of this is going to be one of our biggest tasks, and I'm glad to be with you on that one, and I do appreciate the comments and support. And I think it's also appropriate at least one more time to express our gratitude to Carlene, who for the past couple of years kept us focused and moving through an unenviable list of tasks to bring everything to fruition on a timely basis and make what I thought were a very good collection of recommendations. So once again, she will be missed. Those shoes are certainly hard to fill. But you know, we're topically changing a bit and moving on to funding matters and other matters this time. And I'm glad to be with you throughout this. And I would encourage any of you to contact me anytime you want to set me straight about whatever you need to set me straight about. But I'm happy to be with you and appreciate all of you and the Department of Education and Superintendent. With that, it brings us to item number 5, presentation and discussion of the allocation methodology for transportation and food services through the pupil-centered funding plan. The Commission will receive a presentation regarding the proposed methodologies that may be considered when budgeting for transportation and food services through the pupil-centered funding plan in future biennia. This discussion is a continuation of the agenda item from the previous meeting, which was in response to a request from the Nevada legislature for the Commission to discuss other options or recommendations regarding the methodology. To get us started on that part of the discussion, we have James Kirkpatrick, Administrative Services Officer from NDE. And James, whenever you're ready to proceed, please do so.
Good morning, members of the Commission. My name is James Kirkpatrick, for the record. I am going to present agenda item number 5 regarding the methodology that is proposed or has been requested by the Commission for auxiliary services.
Special education.
The presentation that I am going to walk through will include a review of the data sources that contribute to auxiliary services. We'll review consumer price indexes and their data sources. I will also review the individual components and outline impacts of the methodologies. Transportation and food services data contained within this presentation was the data was pulled from the approved PCFP from the last legislative session. CPI data used for this presentation was extracted from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics and the Nevada Department of
Went all the
Employment
way, huh?
Rehabilitation and Training. During the last commission meeting in August, the commission requested 3 considerations be looked at. The first request was an adjustment for outlier years, or more specifically, an adjustment to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. The commission also indicated they would have liked to have seen a weighted 4-year allocation applied. And the commission indicated that they wanted to look at various inflation rate options. The data sources that are contained within and were used for this presentation, we use the actual district costs that have been reported through the NRS 387 annual financial reports, and from the consumer index data. Again, all that data was extracted from the websites of the BLS website and the DETR website.
Oh, yes, all that data never came from the original schools.
The NRS 387 annual financial report was used specifically to extract this data because first, districts self-report this information, so it is considered a reliable source of actual costs. The reporting requirements already exist for districts, so there would not be any additional reporting burdens added to the districts to capture this information. It is currently managed by the department, and no additional impacts for workload would be incurred by the department.
Just all that
And
public
the
information,
NRS
right?
387 is reported and utilized by the Governor's Finance Office and the Legislative Council Bureau. And for this presentation, we did capture the 4-year of actual cost as reported by the school district. For the CPI data presented here, we extracted January to January index data for fiscal years 2021, 19 and 20, 2018, 2019, 2017, 2018. In calculating and determining the inflation rates used within this presentation, we followed the same methodology that was provided to the department from our subject matter expert when that subject matter expert presented the department with the original pupil-centered funding plan. And I have included the methodology in this slide. There were certain CPI data that I looked at when preparing this presentation. I identified an education-specific CPI. That CPI data is based on national data, not regional or not Nevada specific. And the data included private school only. So that would have been the cost of education or the private school sector. I also identified food at elementary and secondary schools specific CPI. And again, nationally based data based upon the cost of those services in private schools. I also identified a series of CPI data that could be combined and rolled up into a transportation CPI for your consideration. Again, these indexes are nationally based, and it combines the expenditure categories for gasoline, all types, motor vehicle parts and equipment, motor vehicle maintenance and repair, and motor vehicle insurance. And those were rolled together for 4 years, and the inflation rate used in this presentation was developed, combining all of those. That data is not education specific.
That's crazy.
Additional CPI data that was considered for this presentation was a Western region specific CPI. Again, that data was regional data, not Nevada specific and not national. That CPI data included all items, less food and energy. It was an unadjusted index data, and again, not education specific. I also looked at Nevada specific CPI data, and this information was based on Nevada data. It included state and area employment hours and earnings. It combines the government industry sector, education and health services, trade and transportation and utilities. I use the unadjusted index data, and it does include Nevada specific in education industry data. After gathering all of the index data, I developed the various inflation rates tied to those that data. For the presentation purposes, I included the 1.74% ECFP approved inflation rate that was used. That is a 1-year inflation rate. The education inflate, after calculating it out across 4 years, it's a 4-year average inflation rate. So it includes 2017 through 2021. And that came out to be 2.04%. The food at elementary and secondary schools, based on a 4-year average inflation rate from 2017 to 2001 CPU, unadjusted index data, was a negative 4.07%. Transportation, when applied, calculated, was a 4-year average inflation rate of 1.15%. The Western region inflation rate, after being calculated, was 2.53% based on the 4-year average. And the Nevada rate was 1.88% based on a 4-year average rate. When I compared the BLS CPI data with the DETR CPI data, it was the same 1.88%. 1.88%. That's smart. Adjusting for outlier years. So taking the commission's recommendation or request and looking at how hold harmless is done for the average daily enrollment, to make the outlier year adjustment for auxiliary services. What I did for this presentation was mirror that practice, or mirror the methodology identified in NRS 387.1223. Applying the following criteria. Actual costs only will be used to determine any hold harmless adjustment. Auxiliary services actual costs will be compared to the prior year costs. In the presentation, I compared fiscal year 2020 with fiscal year 2019. If there is a decline greater than 5% from the immediate year, then the same amount would be applied from the preceding fiscal year. So it mirrors the ADA hold harmless provision that
ADA
is
attendance
a
mandatory.
part of the NDE history.
That's crazy.
When applying this, this table represents the application of that for the districts. We compared the 2019 to 2020 data, determine the rate of change, and then the hold harmless would bring in
Keep on praying about that
The-
hold harmless.
correct application.
Mhm.
As you can see, it
Depending on the hold harmless,
applies equitably based on the
ain't no equity in
percentage of drop. We applied the same hold harmless methodology to food services. And this table represents how that would be applied on the food services
the food
portion
service.
of the auxiliary service.
Oh, that's how everybody got the food and they didn't qualify. Let me look over here. Oh,
The next item that was requested was to establish a 4-year weighted allocation.
keep on wishing about it.
Again, we started with the base of actuals that was used, that was approved during the last session. The commission also mentioned a 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% across the years. So I went ahead and moved forward with that principle for the presentation. For transportation, you can see the differences between the 4-year average allocation that is currently in the pupil-centered funding plan. And if we applied the 4-year weighted allocation, you can see the adjustment for transportation in this table. For food services, the same methodology is applied.
Nothing to do with
The same
education.
principle. Again, you can see the changes between the two. The third component of the methodology that I explored for this presentation was the application of the inflation rate. This slide just recaps what I discussed earlier in the presentation and identifies the various inflation rates. When applying those inflation rates to transportation, the first column in this table represents what was legislatively approved in the pupil-centered funding plan. Then each subsequent column applies the different rates so you can see the impacts of each rate to transportation. This slide follows the same methodology, applies the rates that are appropriate, and identifies so that the commission can view the impacts to the food services portion of the auxiliary service.
The food services portion of it.
NDE's recommendation for auxiliary services. We recommend the continued use of the 4 years of actual costs as reported in the NRS 387 fiscal report. Apply a hold harmless type of adjustment for the outlier year.
Sorry, not gonna work.
Apply weights to each of the 4 years of actual costs. apply a consistent inflationary factor to all funding tiers of the pupil-centered funding plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, James. We really appreciate that. And I'll remind the members of the commission that this action is for discussion and possible action. I know we have a number of different components to talk through, but we'll go ahead and open it. We also have recommendations from James and NDE as to how to move forward. I'll go ahead and open it for discussion at this time. So first questions for any questions for James regarding the presentation, and then maybe we can get into the substantive elements of this and see if there's an opportunity to bring closure to any of the pieces that affect us. Anyone? Jason?
Thank you, Jason Gowdy for the record. Mr. Kirkpatrick, this is a lot of really, really good work and appreciate it. So I am a fan of a more specific index for transportation and food. Food for CCSD honestly is not a significant challenge. So I just want to make sure we try and get it right. And obviously some of the districts that have a more significant impact, I want to hear from them. But on the transportation piece, can you clarify that transportation and food ones, were those 1 year amounts, or were those a 4-year average? I couldn't remember, and I was trying to look back.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. All of the inflation rates used were 4-year averages.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's extremely helpful. As we think about the hold harmless concept, I like that idea, and then I started thinking about how that works. And so would that be that you calculate the
Okay, so I want to talk about this hold harmless clause too. As the reality is that most people don't understand hold harmless. It has to do with the allocation of money and the dollars that are being utilized within the public school system and how those dollars actually are benefiting the children within the district. And that's why the obligation is to ensure that access is happening. You understand what I mean by access? Meaning that when we're looking at the number of third graders and what they're doing and how they are accessing resources, we want to talk about what the benefit of that perhaps was and what we can do to ensure that we are more inclusive of the children who are not making it. But when your practices have just been established across the board, that by the age of 11, you can be transferred away from your home school and not ever come back. And I'm saying that's permanent. That's like an adult penitentiary system. I mean, because those children are not going to make it. When you move them away from their gifted and talented placement within a local school, what does that mean? But you know, this hold harmless, Nevada would like to have, it doesn't fit. And if it doesn't fit right now, because it doesn't, in 2021, we have to understand that what we're talking about is a lack of public educational options for all children. And these are one-time monies. And boy, Joan Ebert, she would just like to have the Donor's Choice program, and damn it, she's going to do it irregardless. But it's not going to be federal dollars that are kicking out there to the people. No, you better seek some more donations. That's what you better seek, because we have a responsibility to children who are not reading at grade level and perhaps not making it, or the child who is not articulating language by the age of 3. There are just personal responsibilities. So we should all stand up. Want to know about that hold harmless clause that Nevada is seeking that they can't award themselves. I'm gonna push play because I recorded this so I could just do this. I'm loving it.
your average, And if the amount given in year 5, right, which is the current year that we would be in, if that is 95%, or if that's 5% below what we got last year, then that kicks in. I'm just trying to figure out logistically because, and let me kind of explain why that I'm a little confused or challenged, is that if we look at the COVID year, let's say 2020, and CCSD declined by $10 million in transportation costs. That means that when we get to 2021, we're looking at hold harmless at a lower level than normal. And we should have, we spent less than that year. My concern is when you have a outlier year in the average, and we've actually had 2 in this next, when we start thinking about the next biennium funding, we're going to have 2 COVID years, right? We're going to have 2020 and 2021, which were significantly impacted, certainly us from a transportation perspective. And so I like the idea of the hold harmless, but then I started thinking that might cause some challenges because it doesn't address the fact that those years are already lower. And so, the hold harmless only holds you to that lower amount, which wouldn't fund us at a level to which we would need when we go back to full operations. And so, the concept to me, I get it. Like if there's a way to basically utilize that in the 4-year average, that if one of those years, if any of the years in the 4-year average drops below 5% for calculation perspective, those go back to the normalized number, meaning back to the prior year before that. I think that might make me feel better that going forward, we wouldn't be harmed by those few years. And you may have already contemplated that, Mr. Kirkpatrick, I don't know, but I just want to kind of bring that up and get your thoughts and any other thoughts, Mandy. Thank you.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. So when I initially applied the hold harmless methodology, it was to look at each year's actual cost and apply it to the prior year, not based on the average costs for the prior year. There are multiple ways to apply that. And I would offer up that as a year progresses through the 4 years, when you start adding the weighted factor, if the commission chooses to explore that, then that reduction is also mitigated through the reduction of that weight. So there's a lot of different ways to calculate that. In the presentation, I did it the simplest based on actuals year to year and presented in the presentation the comparison from 19 to demonstrate how it would work.
Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So I think what you said is that in calculating year 5, which is using the prior year's 4 averages, if there were 2, you looked at each year and applied a hold harmless each year. So in year 2, you looked at year 1, applied a hold harmless if necessary. In year 3, you compared that. And in year 4, so you applied hold harmless amounts when essentially calculating it each year in those 4 years. So you essentially normalized all 4 years and then calculated the 4-year average, which provided funding for year 5. I'm trying to reiterate to make sure I'm understanding. Is that right?
That is one of the considerations I looked at during the model.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, direction? Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hobbs. I concur. Great work, James. Appreciate all the effort that you put into this. And I think this just exemplifies how effective this model works. I mean, everything we talked about, you have put into action and model for us to take a look at. So I really appreciate that. The one thing that we had talked about before, I think Jason gets credit for this, is we were wanting to perhaps see the impact of separating the capital expenditures, like for the purchase of buses, from the operating expenditures, because that capital inflection really could affect the, I guess, the factor for the transportation or the auxiliary services. And if that were the case, I think the 4-year average would actually adversely affect the transportation piece, because you would never get 100%. It would always be based on inflation, unadjusted inflation previously for your 4-year average. So anyway, I just want to know if you had a chance to take a look at that, whether or not you think it might have any merit, or whether or not Jason is just completely off his rocker.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. I did not go back and try to extract out capital expenditures from the base transportation expenditures. For the purposes of this presentation, I captured the actual costs that were actually identified in the current pupil-centered funding.
Thanks, James. And I think, sorry, I didn't mean to step in there, but, and that's consistent with what we have done in the past as well. So.
Other questions, comments?
Chair Hobbs, I have a question.
Jason, sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate that point, right? So this year, with our medium-term bonds, this will be the first year, at least that I've been here in quite some time, that the district had no need to buy buses. We typically buy between $30 and $35 million of buses each year. And those pieces, so there's going to be 30 million less in those transportation expenditures this year. I think if we were to apply that hold harmless on an annual basis as you go through and recalculate the 4-year average, I think that would negate my concerns. So I think that, as Mr. Kirkpatrick noted, that was one of his options that we can consider as to how to really roll it up. I think that would eliminate my issue. And I think Paul had an issue last time kind of bringing up that some people just overspend in a certain year, and that's why using a weighted average could be a challenge, or using a shorter period could be a challenge. I think that if we looked at the 387 report information, and then as we basically just use a hold harmless each year. So if year 1 is normal, year 2 is extremely below, that essentially becomes year 1 again. And then you compare year 3 to the adjusted year 2, and that I think would negate the COVID impact, or, you know, we could have something else in the future. I hope not. I think this has been enough for all of us, but there could be other economic downturns that significantly impact those pieces and would negate that. So I think if commission considered that component that Mr. Kirkpatrick talked about, the weighted, or the very good idea about applying the hold harmless, and just adjusting it manually to figure out what year 5 funding is, or, you know, the base year after using the 4-year average, that would alleviate my concerns. You know, you still don't get all of it, you know, if you have a couple, but at least that, I think, addresses those concerns and would be something I could support moving forward.
Additional comments or questions? So Jason, are you asking for James to prepare another set of numbers along the lines of what you just described, or defining the methodology and considering that today?
Jason got it for the record. No, I don't need James to go back and rerun the numbers. I think that he's done a good job of showing that piece. And he noted that that was one of his considerations. I think that, you know, I don't know if this is an action item or not, but if it's an action item, you know, I would propose moving forward with, I'd be in support of sticking with the 4-year average as the NDE recommended. Let me just stop. Is this something we could just make a motion on and move forward? This is an action item.
Yeah, this is an action item. Jason,
Okay.
So if you're willing to, you can certainly put it in the form of a motion for discussion.
Okay, well, I'm going to make a motion then that we accept the ND's recommendation to continue using a 4-year average. And also include in that motion that the ND's recommendation, I can't remember the actual recommendation or just part of the presentation, but to utilize a hold harmless concept that was described on an annual basis each year to calculate the average for the prior 4 years. And for this motion, and that would be it. And for this motion, I'm going to stay away from the inflation just in case there's other comments on that specifically.
Okay, so again, I think your motion was rather clear. Is that, James, is it clear to you what Jason is proposing? And you need additional clarification before we get a second on the motion and have additional discussion?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. So as I understand, what's proposed is a 4-year average based on actuals, utilizing a hold harmless that evaluates each of the 4 years.
Yes, that's what I heard, Jason. I believe that's what you stated. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. And again, you're not including in that motion anything to do with the going forward adjustments based on any form of index.
No, sir. I think there's probably a little bit more discussion given the, I guess, disparity between those options. So I would like to hear from other members if there's more comments on those first. Thank you.
Well, we do have the motion from Jason. Do we have a second on that motion for which we would have additional discussion?
Mr. Chair, Member Jensen, for the record, before we go on, I agree with Jason that we're not ready. We need more conversation on the CPI indexes. But Jason, I didn't hear you talk about the 4-year weighted component. Did you want to include that in your motion? I think that was consistent with what we thought in earlier conversations, but it's just not in your motion.
Yeah, Jason Gowdy for the record. I had basically included the fact that I was supporting the NDE to remain with the regular 4-year because of the hold harmless. That I think negated my bigger issues that I had in the past around the changes. And Mr. Kirkpatrick had some compelling facts about why that might be a little bit challenging, make some comments. So I kept it in my motion that it was the 4-year average that the NDE had recommended. So long as we apply the annual, each year looks at the prior year and it looks even at the adjusted year, right? So year 3, if year 2 and 3 are down, right? Year 2 gets adjusted hold harmless. The year 3 is compared to that hold harmless number. So each year is compared to the previous adjusted number. So that was, I did discuss it, but I agreed with what the NDE proposed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense to me. That negates that need for that 4-year average. Thanks for the clarification.
Just to make sure that we're proceeding the right way, and Greg, tell me if I'm wrong. We have a motion here. We still would need to have a second on that motion, but we would have then separate discussion on whatever inflation index to apply to it that could be followed by another motion and discussion. So we're separating the discussion here into maybe multiple motions. That work for everybody? Okay, do we have a second on the motion that Jason made?
Mr. Chairman, this is Paul. I'll second Jason's motion.
We have a motion and a second. Any additional discussion?
Okay, I think I can have some additional discussion because, you know, we need to understand what the intent behind Title I and the federal dollars actually are. They're not like a checkbook that you can just draw down out of, these people act like this federal money is a total entitlement for the state's purpose, for whatever they want to use it on. Because this commission was designed to ensure that they could look at Nevada's resources and then help to sustain the level of adequacy, but not just look at the federal resources and break them on down so everybody gets a piece of the pie. And the people who are generating the money, well, there's just nothing left for them. And so this is why I want to talk about this. And this is why I'm breaking it down. So I'm going to keep on unpausing the video so you can hear what else was said.
Here, no additional questions. Again, voting the same way as we have previously. Anyone who is opposed or wishes to abstain, please signify your preference at this point. Hearing none, that motion is passed. And that leaves us with the discussion then on the inflation component. Questions, comments? AJ.
Thank you, Chair Hobbs. I guess in my understanding of inflation over the years and how those calculations happen and how the feds look at kind of this market basket, but they'll also kind of make adjustments for areas that may be a little too volatile. And so in my mind, transportation and food kind of fall into those categories. And so I do realize that it would be more work, but I think I would be interested, excuse me, in seeing some kind of look at those as separate items as far as the inflation rates are calculated for this. I'm not, I don't know, I guess that's all. I would just say that I'd be interested in seeing that actually those carved out with their own individual rates.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Can't hide it in that area. Transportation and food.
Certainly makes sense. Jason, comment?
I just want to get clarification from AJ because Mr. Kirkpatrick did break out a specific transportation only and a food service only. Unfortunately, in this year or in this look, right, they're lower than any of the other rates. Those were some of the lowest. It's surprising to me in the transportation. These food service, I don't know a lot about food costs, but I didn't know number of fueling if you were looking for something other than that. So I just wanted to get clarification to make sure that I wasn't missing something or we were missing something. When you say separate, different than what the separate components you proposed, or is there something else?
Break it down, please.
Thank you, Margauti. For clarification, no, the rates that James derived for transportation and food are the ones that I'm talking about. The recommendations on slide 20, the last point is applying a consistent inflation factor to all tiers. In my mind, that was kind of this overall inflation rate and whatever it's, and I forget what it is, say it's 2.0, everything within the funding plan would be against that 2.0. And I would see transportation and food not having that 2.0, but having these more specific rates he generated.
Okay, so where we are with the discussion right now is for not having one inflation rate that would apply to both transportation and food services, but having individual rates for each. And that was my understanding of what James had presented as well. Certainly those are highly different commodities with highly different influences that can bear upon them. So I think.
Okay, so let me just explain this little one thing only. That all states have the obligation to ensure access happens for all children. Yes, they do. So when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about food service. Understand when the pandemic hit, everybody's qualifying for this additional food service. But when they're talking about just the allocations and the numbers, and only dealing with the federal money from allocations and numbers, that just doesn't work for me. Because you're supposed to measure the benefit of the youngest and the neediest child. But when you don't have none of that data, and then when I look at your Head Start data, it's really frightening. The early start data is very frightening because they were going to jump to $222 million in revamping the early start program for the city, not for the district. And just because the local district has an obligation to do child find and provide those services, and right within the plan, the support that's structured for those children who they identify with early needs. And I can't find that. You can't find it either. Let me go back to the conversation because we're not talking about the services under at-risk factor. And this whole time, we're not talking about the children in poverty. No, we're talking about the dollars and the allocations, like the shopping. And from a global perspective, they're just scooping the money out and dishing it out. They meet no basic support for any children. So let's not pretend this is what we're talking about because it's not. Let's continue the video, shall we?
It's certainly a wise course to take. With respect to which index, I suppose we can take up transportation first and have a discussion around what your comfort level is with respect to an index going forward for transportation.
Mhm.
Thoughts? Paul?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that I have an official opinion on any of these, but I would really like to see the math behind each one of these and the references so I could see how see the calculations for each one of the rates that are on here. So I could, James, if you could just provide me that, shoot me an email, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you, Paul. And certainly if that's the feeling of the commission, we are not compelled to act on that today. If you need more information prior to moving on the actual indexes, you can request that information and we can certainly have it provided. Jason.
Thank you, Jason Geddes for record. Yeah, I'd like to just look at them, just not to again, just get more detail and kind of walk through the team. I'm in agreement with AJ that I believe that that we should have more specific components around those two pieces. They're unique and they don't really apply to everything. And I think that everybody's probably concerned. And if you're not, you should be concerned about fuel prices. I think we spend, I don't know how much we spend in fuel, but it's a gargantuan amount of money. And what concerns me, I guess, and I know this is how most things are built, right, is the CPI is passed and it's pretty old data. And when there's going to be such a sharp increase in this coming year in fuel costs, there's some challenges. And so, and I don't know if this is palatable or not, but just something for the commission members to think about. If we establish that we utilize those industry-specific rates for transportation and for food service, that they're there and it's treated somewhat the same way that the general fund base per pupil is funded, so that it can't go lower than inflation. Then so maybe if we set a base that we have to at least get the standard inflationary rate that's utilized for the pupil-centered funding plan in totality. So that's, I'll call it somewhat of a hold harmless. But if the specific industry rates are actually higher for transportation and food, then those would then be provided, because there's still other costs in transportation. So if we only got 1% this year, I know that my personnel costs are going to go up a little bit more in the transportation side and those pieces. So again, not ready to make a motion or anything, but just wanted to add some thoughts on maybe a way that this might negate those few years that we, OPEC crashes and oil prices decline, but regular other costs will go up there. But in the years that they're extremely high, the transportation is somewhat protected. So just something to think about.
And Jason, along those lines, I was thinking as AJ was making his comments and others said, one of the things that we may want to consider is, given enough historical information, there may be a reason to do something like considering putting a collar around this or some kind of floor based on past history. I think the idea that you raised of having, perhaps one index serve as the floor and another one that more closely tracks that commodity area, if greater than that index, I think that's certainly something that there may be a great deal of wisdom in that. But we commonly are seeing these days the use of caps, floors, and collars on these as we set them into statute or ordinance or whatever the case may be. So I guess in that regard, we're making an additional request of James to provide some more historical information and maybe some additional research with respect to indexes that are more specifically oriented toward transportation. Food services is probably an odd one. But I think the points that you raised as well, with regard to using past data at a time like this, there really hasn't been a time like this before with respect to concerns about inflation and fuel prices. You guys also have a lot of other things to think about with respect to future transportation issues. Are you going to continue to run the same modes of transportation in the future that you're running right now? Are you going to be shifting over to compressed natural gas or hydrogen or electric or something like that? I mean, this is something that will continually need to be reevaluated going forward, because you can't have these indexes constraining what might make more sense for you guys in the long run too. But so in the short term, I guess we're requesting some additional information from James and deferring the decision on the indexes until perhaps the next meeting if that information is available. Does that sound right? That work? Okay, any other comments before we move the agenda? Okay.
Chair Hobbs, this is Heidi Hartz for the record. We wanted to seek confirmation if the motion that was passed with the 4-year rolling average based on the hold harmless provision was applicable to transportation and food services, or if it was limited just to transportation.
Okay, so we really need to get some clarity on this hold harmless position that Nevada takes, because hold harmless, they want to take a position, a blanket position for the whole state. And then that way they're just allocating numbers. But the requirements for the federal government is when the money went to the local school district, is it the obligation for the district to help provide the budgeting and amendments and support for the people within the school district that live in that school area. Well, that would be, it doesn't really matter, because when you're talking about transportation, you're looking at the number of children, distance from their school, and because this is a urban rule, that some of the transportation was required by law. But then when you run around and establish a lot of programs that have to do with what? What am I talking about? Programs that just simply had to do with meeting none of the federal requirements. Charters and charter schools and whatever you like. But it's not benefiting the children who are generating the money. So for Miss Heidi Hartz to come over here and talk about the use of the money by the numbers and not the benefit of the children who are generating the money or the work that's done in that area is unacceptable. So this is what I'm talking about. Unacceptable. Let's continue the video, shall we? Because we don't have any information, just nothing. Free money.
I'll go to the maker of the motion,
Jason Gowdy, for clarification, you're correct. I did not properly classify, but I was intending it to be for both food and for transportation. And so we'll look to the second to make sure.
Paul, and then we'll survey the rest of the commission to confirm this. Looks like Paul may be getting a snack at the moment. The rest of the commission, that additional clarification will still be with your approval with regard to the motion. Okay. I think we're good, Heidi.
Thank you.
Item number 6. Hey, Paul, we were just getting some additional clarification while you were off video. I don't know, did you hear all of that? Now we can't hear you.
Oh, now I'm all frazzled. I had a brief interruption to the meeting. So I did not actually, guys, so appreciate that. And thanks for this slightly embarrassing moment.
Sorry about that. Heidi had asked for some clarification from Jason, the maker of the motion, as to whether or not the motion applied to both transportation and food services. Jason then clarified that it applied to both this motion. You were the second on that motion. We just needed to get your concurrence that you were still the second.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we're good then. Item number 6. Presentation and discussion regarding expanding the auxiliary services component of the people-centered funding plan to include charter schools. This also is an information discussion and possible action item. The commission will receive a presentation regarding the possible inclusion of charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted students within the auxiliary services component of the people-centered funding plan. In response to a pending request from the Nevada legislature, the commission may discuss other options or recommendations regarding the methodology for allocating funding in future by any. Once again, James Kirkpatrick. Proceed when you're ready, James.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. Agenda item number 6, presented by Department of Education. Auxiliary services expanded. This presentation is going to be a lot more abbreviated than the last presentation. Much of the data is going to repeat from the last presentation. The primary difference is we're going to update you with the impacts, with the estimated transportation, food services, auxiliary services costs that would occur if this item moves forward. In the prior meeting in August, the commission requested the possible discussion related to the inclusion of charter schools and university schools for profoundly gifted students in the allocation of auxiliary services. I captured the charter school data for this presentation out of the NRS 388A and 388C annual financial reports. Again, these are self-reported actual costs from these schools. The reporting requirements already exist, currently managed by the department, utilized by other state agencies, and our actual costs. Again, the same CPI indexes were used and the methodologies were applied in the same manner as from the previous presentation. The impacts with the additional funding needed to support the charter schools and university schools is outlined in this slide. Based on a 4-year average, transportation would increase to $700,000. For the food services component of the auxiliary services, based on actual data applied, the 4-year average would be about $225,000. If we were to take and go back to the hold harmless provision and walking through the similar slides, in this particular table, I have included the charter schools as a combined total to show this impact or hold harmless for transportation. This slide again demonstrates hold harmless for food services. It's the same methodology as used in the prior presentation. I have just included the combined charter school total. Applying the same weighted methodology, I again use the same methodology, the same percentages, and this slide demonstrates the impact with charter schools identified as a rolled up component. Food services, I've also included as the independent table with the impacts. Applying the same inflation rates as identified and discussed in the prior previous presentation. This outlines again what the impacts would be for transportation with charter schools included. And the next slide also includes the food services impacts with the charter and university schools. Again, we're following the same recommendations as in the previous. Use the 4-year district, use the school's actual reported data, apply the hold harmless for the outlier years.
Apply the hold harmless for the outlier years.
Apply the
You
weight
lying about that?
if the commission would recommend that.
Yeah.
Apply a consistent inflation factor. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So I suppose our discussion on this item is really, I guess there's two parts of it, or maybe it's not really two parts. One is the inclusion of charter schools, which we talked a bit about at our last meeting. Through James's presentation, it's clear that the use of indices for transportation and food services, this would also be subject to those decisions that are still yet to be made. So I think the focus of this is the inclusion or not of charter schools as stated in the agenda item. With that, we'll open discussion. Jason, then Jim, then Dusty.
So mine's very brief. I'm in support of including the auxiliary services for the charters, as you know, as they're incurring those costs as well. So I'll listen to other comments and then just wanted to make sure that made that comment.
The American Rescue Money is not supposed to be spent on charter schools.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's a
I am
state-funded
also in support
proposition.
of including these auxiliary services for charter schools. My question though would be, well, first of all, for full disclosure, I do sit on the board of a charter school here in Southern Nevada. And I'm aware of some of the impacts that they have in terms of costs with not receiving these additional amounts. I guess I have a question for the Department of Education on how do we go about applying this to the various charter schools. Some provide transportation, some provide food service, some provide both, some don't provide it at all. I'm just curious. I see the full numbers here, and I'm assuming we'll have to follow a similar methodology that we'll follow for the county districts. And I'm just curious how the department will manage the complexities of applying these numbers to charters.
I want to know too.
James Kirkpatrick for the record. So in preparing this slide now, in the slide presentation, I showed them as a combined total, just for expediency purposes. However, when I went in and looked at it and did the calculate and determine the cost, it was by school. So the detail was there. It's just I rolled it up for the presentation, and I would follow the same exact methodology for charter schools as I do the districts. If they had no prior year costs, then there would be no prior year costs.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Dusty?
Thank you, Chair Hobbs, Member Casey for the record. And Jim answered my first question, or he asked the question I was going to ask first about how would it be applied. So it's my understanding then that the schools that are offering those services will get those funds. So my second question is, how do we address schools that want to offer these services that maybe aren't offering it now? Maybe they only have 1 year of data. Obviously, there's a push to provide more equitable access to education, especially in the charter school sector. And so I'm curious how we would address that if a school wants or needs to offer transportation or food service. And really, I think that question is for my fellow commission members.
Anyone want to take a step?
This is Member Jensen, and I'll just jump in because I think Dusty's comment highlight what when I raised my hand, what I wanted to ask, and I was going to ask it of Dusty, and I think he's answered it. In general, I'm in favor of including charters in this calculation. Where I'm struggling with is, do we create an unintended consequence for what Dusty just identified? Is now do we provide, and I don't want this to sound as negative as I know it will, but do we provide an incentive for charters that currently aren't transporting or providing food service now to do so? And what then becomes the long-term unintended consequence of the availability of resources across all districts, including the charters? That's what fundamentally I'm struggling with, and how would this work in the long run?
AJ?
I am generally in support of this as well, but I have the same concerns as Dr. Jensen. As this was being discussed, just thinking about the number of students that attend the charter schools, and I know that number is similar to the entire enrollment of Washoe County School District, and just looking at the amount of funds they expend on transportation, it's a significant number. So kind of along those lines, yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent. It would be interesting to know to what extent the charters would be, which ones would be interested in expanding and offering transportation services. But clearly they're down the line. I mean, it would take a while, but down the line, there could be a significant impact. And I think it's just important that we're aware of that.
AJ, was that question directed to Dusty?
Sorry, Chair Hobbs. I guess if Dusty has an answer, if he knows what kind of interest there would be, I don't know. I know there's a lot of charter schools, so I'm not sure if he knows everyone. I guess it's more of a general comment of concern.
Dusty and then Paul.
Thank you, Member Casey, for the record, and thank you, Dr. Jensen and AJ. I guess I would kind of ask the question, is it a bad thing? You know, is it an unintended consequence, or is it something we need? You know, if we look at a lot of these schools, you know, ours included, there's a lot of kids in outlying areas that would love to go to our schools that maybe their families can't afford to get them to school or something like that. And so the question is, if there's this push to provide more equitable access to education, you know, is that and I understand there's only a pool of resources, so I'm kind of on the other side of the fence a little bit. As Dr. Jensen mentioned, you know, that would pull resources. But the question is it a necessary pool? And I don't have a feeling for how many of the 50,000+ charter school kids there are, you know, how many of those schools wish to provide transportation right now. I have no idea. But I'm sure there's a handful of them that would want to, because they have a need to do that. And, you know, I think this goes to our greater conversation of getting more resources in this state for education, because it leaves us fighting over scraps, whether it's district and district or charters and districts. So I do think there's a need for it. But I guess, you know, so James, I guess this question would be for James. So James, if a school starts providing transportation this year, they don't receive funding, then their 4-year average would simply reduce to a 1-year average, I'm assuming then, correct, going forward for the next year?
Heidi Hartz for the record. If the Department of Education were to follow the existing methodology that's used in creating a biennial budget request, if a charter school were to be included in auxiliary services and they have only 1 year of expenses incurred thus far, that 1 year could either be used to set the average, or we would be 3 years of 0 plus the 1 year at the actual expended amount.
Dusty, does that take care of your question?
It does. Obviously, I think it presents a problem if you have 1 year of data and you try to average it with 3 zeros. I mean, I don't know that any district would be okay with something like that, especially as we're talking about hold harmless scenarios. So I'd hope maybe a hold harmless would factor into that, and that would set the 4-year average.
Boy, he's praying for that
Well,
hold
that's certainly
harmless.
something to bear in mind as we
Hold
move through
harmless.
this, because I would tend to agree with you on that point, Paul, and then
Hold
Jason.
harmless affects the poor people because they're not getting any services.
Thanks, Chairman Hobbs. I am a little conflicted on this because I do support the concept for those charter schools who have those expenditures to have the factor reimbursement, which makes sense to me. But there is a real adverse financial consequence if we provide an incentive, for example, I think is what Dave was kind of get at, for students to migrate from public schools to charter schools and making it easier. And I also, and this is nobody's fault, I think this is just a reality with the way things are funded. And I'll just use our microcosm here in White Pine as an example. So when the charter school opened, it took 15% of our student population and about 15% of our revenue. So it was about 150 to 180 kids. Which was 5 to 6 teachers if you use a 30-to-1 ratio. So the direct cost that we actually could reduce from our budget, if you just use $100,000 as a round figure for the teacher, that's $500,000 to $600,000 that we had an expense that we could lose because of the student population that went over to the charter school. We lost $1.7 million. So there's a deficit of $1.1 million, which was about $1,000 per student that we had to take from the rest of the students that remained at the school district in order for the charter school district school to operate. That is a fiscal reality that was a severe consequence to the students that remain with the district. Now there's nobody to blame for that. That's just how the system is designed, and that is the economic reality. It would be difficult for me to support something from my position as the finance director for the school district that would further widen that gap and that deficit, that structural deficit that we would experience as a school district. But I completely understand the facts. So there's 2 pieces. One that we have no control of. I think that system of funding is broken and needs to be fixed because one should not be funded at the expense of the other. That's my first. But that's beyond our purview. The second thing, I think what we have tried to do as a school district in order to fund these types of expenditures is for the nutrition program, Dusty, we had to secure some grant funds for equipment through the Nevada Department of Agriculture to expand those services. We actually have capital funds that we could levy that you guys don't have, but I know through USDA rural development, if you guys were to expand transportation, I think there are resources available through there. Matter of fact, our charter school, we have a new charter school that was built that leveraged USDA rural development funds. There are ways for you guys to develop those expenditures that actually could be put into the model if that ends up being the decision for reimbursement. So there would be ways for you guys to fund those in addition to any fund balance or operating resources that you guys might have. So those are some of my thoughts. And I just wanted to point out that the economic reality that we felt, and it's going to be the same. Any school district, Churchill, I think, is another one that has a large percentage of charter school student population. There is an adverse financial impact. And I don't know that it's right. I think that the better way is for there to be more of a mutual gains, collaborative, synergistic atmosphere between the two so that we can share services and do things in the best interest of students. But if you've experienced a budget cut, it's hard to also then provide cooperation of services. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks, Chair, for the time.
Thank you, Paul. Jason, you still have a comment?
Yeah, Jason got it for the record. I completely agree with Paul on the funding challenges, right? I think that, we have significantly more charter school students than anybody else, and we have the same issues. We've got a bigger budget, but it doesn't change the same concept. And I think that gets back to either the next item or the item after this, right? That we start talking about funding optimization, right? If we get the funding right in the state, this becomes not really an issue. So it gets back to that. So I completely agree with Paul's concern. And I think the only way that gets fixed is that we move forward with the funding optimization recommendations. Dr. Jensen and Member Fueling bring up, the same concerns I have, right? I don't want this to be a method for them to all of a sudden start getting things, but I agree with what Member Casey said, is that I think that if charter schools have been provided as an option of choice, it should be a fair playing field, right? And I think that, providing them the same funding to provide transportation and food is the right component. And I think that, somewhat of a deterrent from everybody just starting to do this is they still have to expend funds, right? So they have to have at least 1 year. And maybe there's a recommendation they have to have 2 years. I mean, we could do something so that it's just not an all-in type concept. There's got to be some skin in the game first to make sure that it works before state funding is provided. So, I'm still in support of providing these funding through the model in the same way that we've done it with the district transportation and food, knowing full well this is going to cost CCSD some money. But I still believe, again, this is a state commission looking at what's best for all of the students in the state and not just CCSD. I think that that's the right answer. And I would look to other members to maybe, if there's, some interest in if there has to be 2 years of expenditures before. And I think Ms. Hart's answered the question that the NDE is open to, sounds like maybe a recommendation from the commission as to how those averages would be calculated, right? So if they had 1 year and we use the 4 year, they're only going to get 25% of that money. I don't know if that's right, if the rest of the commission agrees, or to do what Ms. Hart said and essentially make that a 1 year average. Because again, there's 2 ways to limit the overflow of everybody just doing this, and that's by requiring a number of years. They have to spend monies first before they get reimbursed, or that they only get a portion until they get to 4 years. They only get 25%. The next year they get 50%. So, or if the commission believes the right thing to do is just allow them to, as soon as they start spending money, get it. But I would propose that there's some sort of limitation, either through the calculation or through that they have to have, maybe 2 years of expenditures to qualify. Might negate some of the concerns of Dr. Jensen, AJ, myself, Paul, et cetera.
Very much, Jason. I was kind of headed down that same road. I mean, this sounds very analogous to other discussions that we've had in past years around broader tax matters. The apportionment of certain taxes between and among counties or entities within counties, and what happens if a new area incorporates and sort of upsets the apple cart, right? And much like Jason was describing, what we've done in those cases is considered a couple of things. One, establish some a minimum threshold for what is the provision of transportation in this case, let's say, or the provision of food services. It's probably not one person taking an Uber, right? It's something a little bit more significant than that. The second would be allowing the new entities to participate required a process that they would go through in the case of local governments, usually involving the Committee on Local Government Finance or the Tax Commission or something along those lines to validate a baseline amount for them. And along those lines, I think Jason was sort of bumping up against that. I think the expenditure has to take place before the participation. And I guess the question remains as to whether or not, there being some level of participation incentivizes that, but certainly something could be constructed where every 2 years, probably in conjunction with the biennial budget, there's some verification done. If something meets certain minimum thresholds, then participation could occur. The question with respect to the how do you do a 4-year average with 1 year of information? I don't know how sensible that actually is to, 3 years of zeros and then 2 years of zeros and then another zero to compute an average. That doesn't sound very sensible to me or responsive. But certainly if there's a verification process for participation that is prescribed, that NDE goes through at the time that it prepares its budget, certain minimum thresholds that have to be met to participate. I think there's a way of getting there from here is my point. Now, whether or not, I don't think we're prepared for that part of it today, and would probably be sending names back to do a little bit more work, taking those notions, if you guys agree with that, taking those notions and putting it into the form of sort of policy statement. Might be a way to go. I think there's generally consensus. And again, I'm just inferring from what I've heard from you guys, but I think there's no consensus for participation in the charter schools, which I think is a great step forward in answering that part of the question. The part remaining is how, particularly in light of a changing environment and new participants. Dr. Jensen.
Thank you, Member Denson, for the record. I just wanted to share again, fundamentally, I'm absolutely in agreement. And if we were just simply looking at what was proposed by Mr. Kirkpatrick today, you'd have an unequivocal yes from me right now to move forward. Where I'm struggling at this point is an unknown. And I have hard times with dealing with things that I can't project, I can't see, and I can't move forward on. And then I'm trying to balance that with how then do we use the inclusion of the charters to help strengthen our message to legislators as we talked about the optimal conversation. So it's not a motion, but I'm just thinking outside of the box or thinking along the lines, if we were to vote in favor of those that we've got hard figures on, and then through the charters on an annual basis, since that's likely where it's going to be, as they're able to gather information and confirm it, it comes back to the commission so we can see actual fiscal impacts and can articulate that to the legislature. We've got the validation piece, and now we've got a communication tool. Where if we just accept it as it is today and create this open-ended measure, I don't know how to effectively communicate that and track it. So again, fundamentally, I absolutely agree with it. Where I struggle is an unknown, and I don't like dealing in unknowns.
Other comments or direction? Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems to me that it sounds like that there is no objection to those schools who are currently incurring those expenditures to get reimbursed, for lack of a better phrase, for those expenditures. And it seems like the issue would be more that how do we address somebody starting the startup costs for those types of things. And if that is something that we could have a discussion for at a next meeting, it seems to me that we might be prepared to have a motion to afford those charters who are currently incurring those expenditures to get the same reimbursement factors that school districts do. And I think we have a call that might need to be on mute.
Yes, we do. 9681. Okay, well, I think your point is a good one, Paul. If that's the desire of the commission to separate that issue or limit the extension of funding to charter schools who currently provide it, that seems like a pretty absolute statement, with the notion that we would need to address further those. I think your point is a good one, Paul. If that's the desire of the commission to separate that issue or limit the extension of funding to charter schools who currently provide it, that seems like a pretty absolute statement, with the notion that
Can the state manually mute people?
We're working on it now. Thank you.
A little bit of an echo going on here. I think we can separate those two if that's the commission's desire, and the direction would be to address those that may be providing them in the future and come up with some methodology for that, separate and apart from those that are providing them now, Paul, if that's the direction that you were. Jason, do you have your hand up?
Well, thanks, Chairman Hobb. And before Jason interjects, and I agree with Jason's statement. This is a point where I have to separate my role as the CFO of the school district and my role as a member of the committee. And I would support even the implementation of those services for schools that need it. We would just need to figure out a way to calculate that reimbursement, because I think this is about the kids and the students. And although that may have adverse financial impact to my school district, my position as a member of this commission is to serve the students of the state of Nevada. So in that respect, I think I'd be in support of that in both implementation and reimbursement of existing operations.
Jason.
Thank you. I was just going to ask Paul if that was a motion, or if he's going to make a motion. If not, I will.
That could be the motion. If you need me to put that in terms of a motion, or I prefer to hear from Dusty since he's got his hand up.
There you go, Dusty.
Thank you, Member Casey, for the record. And I appreciate everybody's comments. I think this is probably a good way to proceed. My only question would be, what exactly are we asking NDE to bring back? Is it something we would like NDE maybe to collaborate with the SPCSA on and bring some sort of concept back? I guess I'm looking to the other members who have concerns of what we want to continue to talk about, or what we want to see to further the conversation.
Jason, comment?
Thank you, Jason Gutting, for the record. Yeah, I mean, I think in support of moving forward with exactly what Paul said, which I'm going to review, is that we move forward with recommending that charter schools be included in food. Existing schools that have existing costs as of now are included in the model, with to move forward with the caveat that we will look at how new schools get added. And I think, what I would look, at least personally, to get from the NDE is just a recommendation, and they can certainly work with the Charter School Association, et cetera, to basically come back and understand how schools would then qualify to meet those reimbursements moving forward, and whether that is they have to show 2 years of expenditures, or as Mr. Hobbs, some sense of what I'll call reality from an expenditure perspective, and really just look for the ND to make some recommendations as to how they would, how they see people qualifying and those pieces. So.
Trustee again.
Thank you, Member Case again, and I apologize. The only issue I might see, and NDE would have to tell us this, I guess, is we may be in that situation already with the existing schools. I don't know that for sure, but I'm not sure that the schools that are currently offering that have offered it for 4 years, especially if we go back to 2019, 18, 17, as this data is presented. So I'm not exactly sure what makes up those numbers there. I would hate to see, a school that had offered it in 19 and 20. Well, obviously they're offering it this year as well, get some type of 4-year average that's now cuts their funding down or something of that level. So that would be my only concern. I'm happy with, moving forward, including charters and having this conversation to try to nail that down. But I am concerned we may be in that situation currently.
Paul?
Yes, Chairman Hobbs, if you're ready for that motion, I'm going to try to rephrase that in terms of a motion. Then I'll make a motion that the charter schools be afforded the same calculations for factors for transportation and food services or auxiliary services that are afforded to school districts, and that we look at some sort of phasing in adjustment for those charter schools who are not currently providing those services.
We have a motion. Is there a second? Jason? You're the
Thank
second.
you. Just a question on that motion before I second, to address Dusty's point. I don't know if we need in there a specific component of the motion that if a charter school that's existing right now has provided services for less than 4 years, that they would not use the 4-year average. So I agree with Mr. Hobbs that wouldn't be the right way to do it. If there's 1 or 2, they would, and if the maker takes this as a friendly amendment to state that for those charter schools in existence now that are providing services that do not have the 4 years, the average would only be calculated off of the actual years they've incurred costs rather than the 4-year average. Is that?
So Jason, clarification on that, it would be, if they provided it for 4 years, it would be the 4-year average. If it's any number of years less than that, the average of the years for which it's been provided.
Yeah, if that's acceptable to Mr. Johnson.
Well, that would be fine. And I thought with it being open-ended, let a phasing adjustment that any number of calculations could be proposed. That could be one of those, and it could be something else. And I think I'm more concerned with those who are not providing services, who may want to provide services. How do we calculate an average or a phase-in adjustment for 1 year or something like that? Or how are they going to go? As they're planning, how are they going to identify how they're going to start those services with the understanding of the future impact of the reimbursement? So I purposely left it open-ended so that could be developed and not directed necessarily from us in case there are better ideas.
Okay.
Thank you. Then with that, I'll second that motion.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. And just to interpret that motion again, Paul, at least for my own clarity, it's limited to providing the same benefits to charter schools who already provide the service, but anything else with respect to the calculation of an average for those that may have been providing it or those that will be providing it in the future, that matter comes back for further action by this commission.
That is correct. And it also excludes the inflation piece, which we're also going to contemplate later for school districts.
Okay. Good.
So,
That's
Mr. Chair, if I may, Member Jensen, my hand was up just to get the clarification that you just asked for. Could I please ask that Paul reframe his motion? Because when I heard his original motion, The way that it was framed and we capture it indicated to me that we have now created this open-ended opportunity. Your clarification narrative to what I believe our intent was, those that are currently receiving the reimbursement, and then we will start talking about a mechanism down the line for the rest. I'm still confused if what the real intent of Paul's motion was.
I'll return that to you for perhaps a restatement of your motion, and then back to the individual, Jason, who made the second on the motion.
Yeah, well, the motion was basically that we provide the factors for transportation and food services for those charter schools that are currently operating those programs and services. So they wouldn't receive the reimbursement if they weren't incurring those expenses through operations. That was the intent. And then also to look at for future discussion, how do we deal with those charter schools who are just getting into the game or want to get in the game, so to speak.
Dr. Jensen, does that offer you the comfort that you were looking for?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, and Jason, with that restatement, your second is still good?
Yes.
Okay. Any additional discussion, question, clarifications? Seeing none, again, voting the same way. If you're in opposition or abstaining, please indicate. Hearing none, that moves forward. We'll look forward to getting that additional information then from NDE, working with the charter schools to develop some kind of methodology or alternative methodologies that can be looked at for those schools that may look to provide those services in the future, and how that would, how they would be able to participate, and also for additional clarification of the calculation of the 4-year average for those that have perhaps not provided it for the full 4 years. Those two matters will then come back to us. Make sense?
Chair
Okay.
Hobbs, Heidi Hartz, for the record, we have a point of clarification for the record, please. We would like to confirm that the motion includes charter schools as well as the university school for profoundly gifted students.
I'm getting a nod of the head from Paul. I can't see Jason, but I think
Yes.
nearly everyone here was presuming that we were using charter school as a shorthand for both.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Well, item number 7. Presentation and discussion of the Nevada revised statutes that may be impacted by the implementation of the people-centered funding plan. This is also a possible action item, although I think we'll probably be getting more information than anything else today. The commission will receive a presentation summarizing the recommendations previously presented by subject matter experts regarding the impact of the people-centered funding plan on various sections of the NRS. The commission may make additional recommendations to NDE staff regarding other areas for review or recommended revision. I believe this is something that Mr. Mathers asked for at the last meeting, and we have Bo Bennett, management analyst with the Student Investment Division from NDE, here to help walk us through that. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Bennett, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Hobbs and members of the commission. So as Chairman Hobbs stated, this presentation will be centered around the reporting requirements associated with the people-centered funding plan. Today's presentation agenda will be to review the statutory reporting requirements that have been altered by the people-centered funding plan, and take a review of the current reporting requirements as presented by WestEd during a December 29 commission meeting, and then to ask if the department needs to take a deeper look into any specific statutory or reporting requirement. The revised reporting requirement with the pupil-centered funding plan revolves around the requirement to report expenditures associated with the purchase of books, computers, hardware, and software for each grade level. This has been altered from a requirement to a recommendation. And with that, the need to request a waiver has been revoked, and any accounting and reporting that go along with the request for a waiver has been eliminated. There have been 3 repealed reporting requirements due to the pupil-centered funding plan. The first is a statutory requirement to report the removal of the state supplemental account and any accounting and reporting requirements associated with the state supplemental account. Removal of an annual report associated with county taxes for safety and security of public schools, and the removal of achievement and performance target effectiveness reporting. The new reporting requirement as part of the pupil-centered funding plan is by October 1st of each year, each school will look at the description of the personnel and services offered by each public school for the previous year and any anticipated changes for the current year. This October report includes each grade level offered at the public school, number of pupils, the average class size, persons employed by the school broken down by subgroup. These subgroups are instruction, support, administrative, or other. The adjusted base per pupil funding amount for each weighted category. And notably, it also includes a per pupil amount spent on supplies, materials, equipment, and textbooks. This appears to be somewhat duplicative and be an opportunity for potential reporting differences due to the minimum statutory requirement. A month later, the department will pull those numbers spent from the 387 report and compare them to the minimum reporting requirement suggestion. So those are two times within a month that we're reporting on the same issue. The last thing the October 1st report includes is the number of pupils in each weighted category and the number of personnel dedicated to providing services to each of those categories, and the total amount of money received to support operations in a per pupil amount. As previously mentioned, West Ed presented on current reporting requirements in December of 2019 when they grouped the reports into related categories. First, these categories being requirements for the budget. These requirements include proposed expenditures and the per pupil funding and weighted funding amounts, which are part of the new October 1st reporting requirements that we just discussed. The next subgrouping is the reporting requirements for expenditures, which require expenditures for the current year, the amount paid for health insurance and supplemental duties, as well as an explanation for ending fund balance should said balance be declining for 3 consecutive years. Next grouping of reports was personnel. This requires reporting of licensed and non-licensed employees separated by fund, the assignment of the employees, the number of staff, and then our October 1st reporting, new reports, which add the requirements of number of staff in each subcategory, which would be our weighted subcategory,
And each site
a description of the personnel in the following year, and the number of staff dedicated to students in each weighted category.
per site.
Next West Ed grouping was around compensation. This consists mainly of the 387 report and includes salaries for licensed and non-licensed employees, salaries for part-time and full-time employees separated by fund, the number of employees whose salaries increased due to being a speech pathologist, a certified school library media specialist, or due to certification by the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards. It's schedule of salaries, rates for fringe benefits and healthcare, as well as the amount paid for supplemental duties, is also required. Reporting related to demographics consists of the average daily enrollment counts that occur quarterly, with October 1st being the count day used to estimate the enrollment of weighted populations. The federal ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act requirements for the number of students in each set subcategory and the number of pupils who receive a free or reduced price lunch. The subclassifications under ESSA are different than the weighted population counts under the pupil-centered funding plan, so this would not be a duplication. Reporting requirements around personnel performance consists of ratings from the performance evaluation system and the professional development provided, which again was part of our new October 1 report. Reporting requirements for school resources include records of inventory and of capital improvements owned, leased, or operated by a school, the per pupil expenditure for supply, material, equipment, and textbooks, and the distribution of teacher and resource plan. The final grouping that West Ed performed is around participation. And this includes a description of services provided in the previous year and any anticipated changes, which is again as part of the new October 1st report. The career and technical education offered by the school, the curriculum and any remedial or special programs offered, and the communications to parents and the average class size. With that, the department would like to know if the commission wishes to identify other areas of statute that require review based on the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Please do.
Thanks very much, Bo. I think the first member of the commission I would turn to that requested that this item be on, if Mark is still on the line with us. Mark, is this getting at what you were, what your objective was when you asked for this last meeting? And we may not have Mark. I think the notion was to identify any other areas of statute that are maybe stale at this point because of what transpired with pupil-centered funding plan, or anything else that could be modified and identified for further review. Paul, you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Chairman Hobbs, appreciate that. I think on our recommendations list, one of those was ending fund balance. And I don't know that we had codified. It doesn't affect the mechanics, the formula, or anything like that. But I think we had clarified what we thought the definition of ending fund balance should be. And I don't recall that made it into statute, which actually led me to another question. I don't know if this is the time to ask it or not. It is, how do we make certain that the recommendations that we make that might affect policy actually get codified? And I'm wondering in the future whether or not we should have specific.
So I want to just talk about what that end fund balance was, because they were requiring all schools who received such a large amount of money to reserve it so that they could sweep it back. And that's called supplanting. So let's just understand that they haven't changed their tune.
Language come before our commission based on policy recommendations. But the ending fund balance was the only one that I could think of that was kind of outstanding.
Thank you, Paul. And before we go further, to Dr. Jensen, if you've been raising your hand and I've been missing it, I certainly apologize for that. Paul right in the middle, so it's easy to see, and he waves, you know, both arms and goes crazy.
He's got a big head.
So I apologize if I've missed any of those. Jensen. Any other comments? Direction? I suppose we could take that again just as an information item today. I did make note of, Paul, what you just mentioned with regard to ending fund balance. I know that's been an issue. Any other direction going forward? And I'll try to reach out to Mr. Mathers too and see if this satisfies his reasons for requesting this item. Any other issues, questions? If not, we'll move the agenda. Item number 8. Discussion regarding optimal funding. This is an information discussion and possible action items. The item reads, the commission will review and discuss the funding recommendations previously outlined in the report prepared and delivered by the commission. The review will include a summary of identified funding targets, potential funding sources, alternative funding scenarios. The commission may provide direction regarding the information contained in the report and identify subjects for further examination. All that I really had in mind today, this is going to be a standing item and an item of great importance, I think, to all of us. As we go through this and we talk about areas like transportation or auxiliary services, or frankly, anything else that we're talking about, there's a recurring theme that additional funding is something that would also help deal with some of these issues that we have. And there's no question that that's one of the objectives and principal reasons for the existence of this commission. And I thought maybe what we would do today, and I'll try to do this as painlessly as possible, is review what we've essentially already done. It's been some number of months since we've had that in front of us, and just wanted to remind everybody what we included in the April report. Talk about that a little bit, and then get our thoughts together as to how we wish to proceed. Because again, that's something that I think we'll be dealing with in one of the most important charges of this commission. With that, if Jessica, someone up there can load the PowerPoint. I don't happen to have that here to be able to share screen. Are you guys able to do that?
Yes, we're working on it now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll just indicate next when we move through this, but some of the preliminary recommendations that we made along the way over these last couple of years, optimal funding levels, some time frames. I think as important as anything else, establishing some initial funding targets or financial targets. We had a lot of discussion relative to optimal funding, and we should continue to have those discussions, but we used as a proxy for purposes of trying to quantify this some other numbers, the national average and the APA recommended levels of funding. We identified some funding scenarios along a part and parcel of that would be identifying revenues that could be considered by the legislature. Those were based on guiding principles that this commission took the time to go through and establish at the very beginning. And using those principles to associate the revenues that we identified with those guiding principles. Next.
I wonder what those are.
We had discussion about really 3 different levels of funding over the last many months. The first one was the restorative funding to the 21 biennium budgeted dollars, including inflation and enrollment, adequate. And you see the per pupil amounts. Nevada at for fiscal 20, I believe it was, Paul, $9,249 per pupil in spending. contrasted with the national average of $12,645. Again, contrasted with the professional judgment recommended level of $14,337. In any regard, Nevada's current level of funding is below both of those measures, which are really more in line with adequacy than they are optimality. And then you see at the bottom of the slide, the optimal funding levels still a matter of discussion as we move forward, more conceptual at this point. And we felt the need to at least quantify something to be able to identify funding targets and methodologies to approach that. Next. And as you may recall, there were tiny little tables with tiny little numbers in them, but we divided this in essentially to two sections. One, funding to the national average, and the other funding to APA. We looked at both an 8 and a 10-year funding scenario. Next. And now we actually see them. Focusing on scenario 1A. There's a lot of data on here, but this presumed a 10-year phase-in to achieve the national average. Scenario 1A did. Scenario 1B is an 8-year phase-in, but let's focus on scenario 1A at this point. If you look over to the right-hand side, you'll see under the section resulting shortfall, the annual incremental shortfall or otherwise amount needed in each one of those years to maintain pace with the phasing to get us to the actual national average in year 10. Obviously, those are fairly aggressive numbers, averaging something like $218 million in new revenue each year for a 10-year time frame, totaling $2.17 billion in aggregate shortfall compared to national average at this point. Scenario 1B again focuses on an 8-year phase-in. Some of the thinking between the 10 and the 8-year phase-in had to do with whether or not the current biennium would be counted as the first 2 years toward that. I still think at this time we're probably wise to focus more on the 10-year phase-in. Next slide. And this is a similar illustration, but this would bring us to the professional judgment level of funding over the same 10-year period in scenario 2A. The incremental shortfall is considerably higher, approximately just eyeballing at $324 million average per year over 10 years in new funding each year. And I always try to stress that because I don't want it to be misunderstood that $324 million in 1 year would satisfy this problem. We would need it each of those years. Next slide. So the revenue considerations, I do think the word tax gets you more points than that on Scrabble, but examining the existing tax system and looking for ways to collect or manage existing taxes without having to resort to new revenue sources. That was a priority when we were putting that paper together. Improving the efficiency of the tax base can be taken a lot of ways, but I've talked to you folks in the past about the way we assess property for property taxation, the fact that we use depreciation, the fact that we have abatements and all of those sorts of things, somewhat distorting the true measure of value of property and our overall taxing capacity for property tax. And of course, one of the items that remains is exploring other new or different revenue sources as complementary or supplementary funding methods. And I suppose one could view the adjustments to the mining tax as something along those lines. Industry-specific taxes were something that we had some discussion about. There were a couple of concerns about industry-specific tax, one of which was they're not as broad-based as other forms of taxation. And second, and I think as importantly, they rely on the vibrancy of certain specific industries like mining or gaming or finance or whatever the case may be for them to perform adequately over a long period of time. Just 1 second. That's all the time. Next slide. These were the guiding principles, just to remind you, and looking at the different revenue sources that we reviewed. Sufficiency is extremely important. We have some aggressive funding targets that we've established, and obviously any revenue source that we look at needs to be sufficient to provide for that level of funding. I think all of the finance directors would certainly agree with this, that the stability and predictability of those revenue sources over time, our ability to rely upon them, focusing on perhaps lower volatility sources of revenue or taking existing forms of revenue that we have and making them less volatile would be a wise thing to do. Certainly an important point in taxation is maintaining a reasonable competitive position with respect to other states and what goes on across borders. Certainly something that we're always aware of in equity. It would be hard to go forward with anything that we didn't feel from both a horizontal and vertical perspective treated different classes, treated similar classes of taxpayers in a similar manner. Next slide. And this brings us to what we really pared the list down to. Property tax and sales tax. Now, admittedly, anytime you mention either of those, you get a certain type of reaction, particularly from elected officials, because these are certainly not popular, not easy to deal with. But from a sufficiency standpoint, there are few, if any, other places we can really focus our attention to achieve the level of funding for education that has been targeted. Next slide. Now we'll get into talking a little bit more about the property tax side. It certainly checks off a number of the items, the principles that we identified. Property taxation is a broad-based revenue source. Despite its lack of popularity, it's broad-based, residential and commercial, industrial, all types of property are affected by it. All states generally have some form of property tax, and property tax is among the most stable and predictable revenue sources that exist within the local government or the government funding portfolio. Some of the areas that we identified, and I know I'm moving through this rather quickly, but in my mind, the abatement issue, and some of you may be more or less familiar with the abatement issue, but it's a big one. It's something that was put into place several years ago to cap the growth of a property tax bill for residential property tax payers at no more than 3% a year, and for non-residential property at no more than 8% a year. There's other calculations that go on that oftentimes render the amount of Griffin property tax to much less than the 3% and much less than the 8% over time. And what the abatement really is taxes that are accrued against the property but not billed against that property. And the current level of abatement, the combined abatement of the state is in excess of $1 billion today, and it's a value that grows over time. Its application to education funding, there's really two ways of looking at that, and I think this is a really important point. One would be if the abatements were either phased out or removed. Education is, as I recall, roughly 35% of the total abatement. Now, some of that's spread out over operating and some of that's spread out over capital, but I don't see that to be a terribly big impediment. That's certainly one way of doing it. If you did it that way, the other local government governments that share in property tax from the state to counties to cities, special districts, school funding through the way the property tax is levied and rerouted back through the state education fund, all would be affected. Another way of doing something like this would be to take the level of abatement, remove the abatement, reduce the entire property tax rate by an amount that would leave you with a revenue neutral number. And even though that doesn't necessarily generate additional revenue, it generates additional headroom under the $3.66 property tax cap that we have in the state. That would open up opportunities for using some of that headroom to directly fund education. So there are a couple of different ways of tackling the abatement issue. One of the other built-in factors that we have that makes us very unique in the state of Nevada, we're the only state that applies to depreciation to the improvements on real property. 1.5% a year for 50 years to a residual value of 25%. Again, no other state does that. But simply removing the depreciation factor without giving consideration to the abatements might accomplish nothing because of the limitations on the growth of the tax bill from year to year. Now, abatements and depreciation are both things that can be eliminated, or they are things that can be phased out. The third bullet down, the current cap that I mentioned, constitutional $5 per $100 of assessed valuation, and $364 or really $366 per $100 of assessed valuation is the statutory cap. So all combined property tax rates cannot exceed the $364 statutory cap. The fact that it's a statutory cap means that that cap could be modified anywhere above $366 all the way up to $5 at the constitutional level. I wouldn't expect something like that would be terribly popular. Something more along the lines of using the abatement to buy down the tax rates and create some parent would probably be a far better place to go. And lastly, on the assessment side, I think I mentioned to you before that Nevada uses the full cash value of the land plus the depreciated value of it's the replacement value of the improvements depreciated by 1.5% per year. That puts us in a position where the actual taxable value of the property is highly contrasted with the market value, and is generally always under the market value. Most of you and anybody listening, you get your card from the assessor each year. You look at the amount of assessed value on there, and you compare it to what you believe your property is worth, and you see a considerable gap. Next slide. And then we also talked about sales and use tax. Again, it's broadly applied. Tourists, residents, businesses all pay it. It's a little lower on the scale with respect to its stability and predictability. Most states do have sales tax. There are a handful that don't. Equitable, you'll always get some arguments with regard to sales tax and whether or not it's regressive and those types of arguments. We have a unique property tax, or excuse me, sales tax system in the state too. It's very difficult to be able to take the rates that we have in Nevada, and the rates vary by county in the state. I believe we're at 8.35% in Clark, and take that rate and compare it to what the prevailing sales tax rate is in, say, Los Angeles or Phoenix or something like that. Simply looking at tax rate to tax rate tells you very little, because what really matters is the depth and breadth of the actual sales tax base. And here in the state of Nevada, we only apply sales tax to the retail purchase of tangible personal property. So implicitly exempted from sales tax are things that are not tangible personal property and not sold at retail. The tangible personal property limitation brings to mind the fact that our economy.
You know what he means by tangible personal property? He said the only thing is, Nevada's tax system is limited to tangible personal property. So the house, the car, you know what I'm saying, of value. Like, but entertainment and other things that they go on here, gambling, stuff like that's not tangible. So they don't tax it. Money, they don't tax it. So they don't tax like your winnings because they want you to gamble here, even though the federal government will tax your winnings. And that's what he means.
Days is in excess of 60% services and 40% goods. So we're somewhat explicitly exempting. Well, I guess it's more implicitly exempting 60% of our economy from the application of sales tax because of the way we define that in the state. And then on that less than 40% that's actual goods and tangible goods. We have a number of explicit exemptions that are written in the statute for certain items, a lot of which make good sense from a social standpoint. You know, things like food purchased at grocery stores, prescription, the list goes on for a couple of pages. And many of you may recall that we added to those explicit exemptions a couple of elections ago when we added a couple of specific items. One of them, I believe, was oxygen. Another one were some feminine products. So over time, what we're actually doing by adding to those exemptions is further narrowing the base that we apply the sales tax to. And I've long been a proponent for evaluation of the sales tax base because one would not have to do anything with the sales tax rate if the base was expanded. And if the base was expanded, the actual sales tax base would be less volatile over time. Because naturally what happens if you have a narrowly applied sales tax base, those items that, and I'll tell you what, I've been watching this very closely for the last 18 months because of COVID. And I've been amazed at some of the things that I see, but certain areas of trade end up dominating the sales tax base. You know, for example, in Clark County, just under 20% of the total sales tax base is eating and drinking establishments. And because those are so closely associated with levels of tourism, that's one of the reasons why Clark County was hit much harder than other counties who are less reliant upon tourism. If construction materials happen to be a big part of the base because of the level of construction that's going on when construction wanes at some point in the future. And we see this in the durable goods and several other categories within the sales tax base. Naturally, you're going to have a decline in that base, and consequently, it becomes volatile and subject to downturns during down economic times. So, a couple of the things that we've been thinking about here for some time is number one, a re-examination of some of the explicit exemptions to see if they continue to perform a valid social service, and an evaluation of our overall economy for those types of discretionary purchases that fit into the service category. Now, that could be done in a couple of different ways as well. You could just simply add that to the sales tax base, or you could have a separate category for discretionary services against which you apply a different rate than that which is applied against all other taxable sales. So there are a couple of different ways that could be approached here. Next slide. Which leads us to next steps. And again, I know that was an awful lot to swallow here in a very short period of time. But, we need to look at the potential changes to property tax and sales tax, some of which I very quickly summarized for you as I think the more likely contenders for future consideration. Quantify the impact of making those changes. For example, phasing out abatements, capping abatements, eliminating depreciation, changing the basis of the assessment evaluation of property, or expanding the sales tax base. we would need to be able to quantify those and compare those to the funding needs and make specific recommendations. The commission, and I want to thank Paul actually for these slides. I should have done that at the outset. We've had different variations of these presentations in the past, but Paul took it upon himself over the last several weeks to put together a slide deck that he's using for other purposes, and I kind of pirated from Paul's work for this presentation today. So I certainly want to thank Paul for all of his efforts. But the commission also recommends that funds be allocated to support additional work that may be necessary to refine some of these calculations that we're talking about can get rather complex. They can be rather time consuming, but they are also rather important to this process. And we want to make sure that we have the resources necessary to pursue this in an effective and efficient manner. So that's largely what those bottom two bullets are. I had a bunch of other stuff here, but I think this really sort of covers it and leaves us at the point of this is what we reported to the legislature. These are the recommendations that we made. We made those recommendations in the report that we filed in April. That happened to be toward the latter third of the legislative session when the legislature was preoccupied with a number of other matters and did not receive much attention at that point. I certainly don't fault anybody for that. But I think heading into the 23 session, we have a lot to talk about by way of positioning ourselves to put the education funding needs at the top of the list in everybody's mindset ahead of that legislative session. And that involves being able to quantify this as we've begun to do, but also involves all of us on the commission and other resources that may be available to us that are supportive of this mission, to amplifying and multiplexing this message to anyone and everyone out there. So this isn't something that can be conveniently overlooked. You can go ahead and take the slides down.
Cannot be conveniently overlooked, the outcomes, the maintenance, the effort.
And with that, that was a lot. I know I just got a text. Jason has a comment or a question.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm on the phone.
Gotcha.
Perfect. Hey, Guy, this is great. You and Paul, and I know there may be others that are working on this, but very good. I think this is the path that we need to start approaching. And my only comment is that I think that given the importance of this, I think that, I know that you're putting this on every agenda, but I think we need to figure out a plan to how to, for lack of a better term, put full court press on this. I think this is something that all of the bargaining units that represent the employees from all the different districts could certainly get behind and start, really effectively communicating this and utilizing their resources to drive this as well. So again, really great work and just very supportive and want to emphasize the importance and certainly involving these big groups that do have a lot of political capital, as well as lobbying efforts at the session. So thanks.
Let me ask a question. I mean, it's one thing to have our report put together, which we have already done. And what I went over with you are things that are contained in the report. We've made some general recommendations of things that could be looked at to achieve those funding targets. One approach would be to, as we have this on the agenda, kind of following up on what Jason was saying. I suppose we could maybe on the next agenda drill down further on the property tax side, try to sort through that and maybe make an order of recommendations for consideration. And at the next meeting, maybe do the same thing with sales tax. Going over it in 15 or 17 minutes hardly does the topic much justice. And there will be a lot of questions, particularly on the part of elected officials with respect to these. I mean, again, I've been through this a number of times, and anytime you mention property or sales tax, you get a visceral reaction. But again, you know, the importance and magnitude. I suppose you have to end up comparing the cost of inaction to the cost of going forward with something, right? And I think that's a case that strongly needs to be made. If we don't do anything, what are the costs associated with that? That's something, you know, we can identify certain numbers. They're really big numbers, but what do those numbers really mean? What do you get for them? What happens to you if you don't pay attention to them? But I'm still searching for the best way to message this. Herman would be a huge help in this because that's one of the things that she does and does extraordinarily well. We know that we have to get this out beyond just the confines of the commission like this for it to get any traction. And the best way to go forward with that part of it as well. So maybe doing a deeper dive into the property tax piece. I know that doesn't sound exciting, but I think it may be necessary. And then doing the same thing with sales tax and then focusing on how do we get this message out and forming some more specific recommendation to begin to socialize with the elected officials. Just some thoughts. Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you very much for the thorough explanations. I know you say it's not very exciting, it's very exciting to me. So to talk about these topics and to dive into them. I support everything you're saying. I think, like Jason says, it's time to do a full court press on this. I do think something you brought up about the cost of inaction is very important. I think we have to be very clear. In my experience in dealing with the legislature and having worked at a school district, making it clear what you are going to produce for those dollars, the return on investment for the legislature making that investment. And I don't know that we've necessarily tied those things, except that we're trying to get to sort of a national average or a dollar amount based off of a professional judgment of a study. I think we have to be very, very clear about what that investment is going to mean to the state. And we have to start tying those things together. And I just want to make that point. But thank you again for the presentation.
Thank you, Jim. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, you know, defining the need and, you know, the absolute nature of that need before you talk about, you know, you could do this with, you know, the sales tax base and this with abatements. You have to establish that part of it. You absolutely have to knock that one out of the park. Other comments?
This is Member Morris Sibler. I have a comment.
Thank you, Lisa.
First of all, thank you again. This is my second time watching that presentation, and it was even more remarkable than the first. I think that the simplicity of helping people understand, you know, what options that we have to provide the funding is important, because I think in some ways it's level setting so that we're all starting at the same point and from the same understanding. Some of the other points that the members made, I agree with, you know, in terms of one, the optimal funding level. So we have to be more clear than just the dollars. We have to maybe even show either A, what those dollars would go towards if we had them, or B, what we haven't been able to do based on lack of funding. And maybe it's a combination, because I think in the years that we've had these discussions, it's always, it seems like people try to distract or even detract from the conversation by talking about the lack of transparency. We don't know what the money is going to go to, blah, 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 blah. Well, while we continue to have those conversations, here's what happens to the school system or our education system as a whole. And I think we need to be very clear and able to articulate, you know, the longer we delay these decisions, here's what it looks like on the other end. So in the actual classroom, this is what's happening. And I think that we have a great opportunity. To me, I still go back to the pandemic. I mean, if it didn't show us anything, it certainly showed us the disparities in education. And I think that we're going to continue to see some of those challenges in the future if we are not able to adequately fund education. I think the other thing where we might want to also distinguish is right now people are super focused on one-time monies that came down from the stimulus. I think we really need to be clear, like that is one-time money, the dollars go away, they have to be spent by a certain time. And so what we're talking about is the ability to have a education system that can provide the level of and quality of education needed for our students to be work ready and college prepared and to succeed. And so that is all the way into the future, not just now, because I think folks will be like, oh, you got $1 billion. We don't need to talk about this. And we want to make sure that we can bifurcate that conversation. But again, thank you. I think that your presentation.
She just wanted to bifurcate that presentation. She don't want to talk about it anymore. Everything is about student achievement. I said everything is about student achievement and the intended purposes of the funding that was allocated, wherever it was allocated. And if they cannot demonstrate the children that were being affected by their policies or the implementation of the work, then they're not going to get reimbursed. So I hope they figure out another way to fund those schools, because they cannot document the support happening for the youngest and the neediest children. That's real. It's almost over.
It helps to level set a very complex conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morris-Hibler, and thank you for those comments as well. I mean, yeah, I think that really does define the challenge that we have, and I think it's something we all need to give some thought to. Again, it's one thing to have numbers. I have a lot of experience with presenting numbers and fascinating people with those, or not. But you know, it's the story that underlies the numbers that is always the difference maker. And I would think, you know, talking about education, it shouldn't seem like it's that heavy a lift, but we know from history that it is. Otherwise, we may not be having this conversation as we are right now. And so I think that's the part of it I find more daunting than putting together spreadsheets about how you would go about funding things. So again, I appreciate the comments that you made, Dr. Morris. Anybody else? Paul.
Thank you, Chairman Hobbs. Yeah, you know, the depth of information that you have on this stuff, I have the curse of knowledge, guy. So I appreciate you bearing that curse for all of us. Just one of the things that I wanted to point out is the numbers that you're talking about, the $3 billion-ish amount of money, that is in excess of inflation. So we have to make sure that our model and our funding not only keeps pace with our actual inflation, but increases enough to make progress toward adequacy and optimal. That's going to be a huge lift. And I agree that the sooner that we can start having public discussions to clarify issues and lift the veil of secrecy on these things and address those visceral reactions like you talked about. I think we heard from our preliminary report, there was a knee-jerk reaction about no new sales taxes. So having these discussions early enough to address those real concerns from our constituents, I think is really important.
So what they need to talk about is how they made everything work, and they always made it work at the high cost of excluding people, and that would be the Black community. And they don't even let them come to the table. So they don't even understand that the requirements for the grants, federal grant money, is to partner up with the local community and talk about the lack of outcomes or the maintenance or what's happening and what's not happening. But they've not been to the table. When they go to the table, they talk about what they used to do. And this is not a used to do moment. And that's just real. When they go back to recording, playing the conversation, got about, let me see, 40 minutes more.
And I think this is the most important thing that we're going to do as a commission. I honestly think that even as flawed as the old formula was, if we had added weights to that formula and had adequate funding, I don't know that there would have been as much criticism of the older funding formula. Now that we have that change, that excuse about a broken funding formula is over. Now the quid pro quo was, now that that has been fixed, so to speak, we can now make progress on the adequacy and optimality piece. And I agree. And I think we need to be very, very aggressive in doing so, because 10 years is going to be over in a flash. And every year that we don't do something deprives another year of high school, the K through 12 students, opportunities that they should have otherwise had. And we're learning that we need to teach the whole student. So the way we deliver instruction is vastly different than the way it used to be. So the supports that we don't have for social and emotional learning, and a lot of those things that affect a student's performance in the classroom, are things that we've never had in our budget. So it'll be interesting to see. One of the last bullet we had was to do a costing out study to find out, to help us.
So he said the social emotional learning was never in their budget. So they don't try to figure out how to bring all students up. They put chunks of money in different places and they just spend it like that. They have never identified the working materials necessary to have positive outcomes, because that's not what they do. And this is what he's talking about, what they do. And it's dysfunctional.
Get a better measure and I guess visual concept of what adequate and optimal might mean, because if you've been constrained by your spending for so long, that becomes normal and it's hard for you to know what you don't know. So anyway, I'm really excited that we're going down this path. It's going to be very difficult, and hopefully we can do this voluntarily without with being obligated. Thanks.
Dusty.
So hopefully we can do this.
Thank you, Chair Hobbs. And Member Johnson, thank you. This is a great presentation. And I just, Chair Hobbs, this question is for you and your experience and looking at this. And when I evaluate this, I'm trying to think in terms of, okay, what kind of options do we have to reach our goals? Are there enough combinations here that if the legislature doesn't take half of it, that we can still reach our goal? Or is something like property abatements like the linchpin? If we don't get that, we essentially can't reach our goal. And I'm kind of, Member Gowdy kind of made me think of this with his comment about full court press. Is this a situation where we got to have a couple of these, or we're never going to reach that goal, in your opinion?
Sure, I'm happy to give that. First of all, it's hard to put your finger on any other revenue source that the state now has that could achieve these numbers other than those that we've mentioned. Now, again, you could supplement with the mining tax, you could supplement with another industry specific tax, but if you look at past initiatives to create things like the commerce tax, for example, that wasn't anywhere close to the revenue production that we're talking about here. And those were heavy lifts. So, again, I think the list is naturally constraining. And on the property tax side, yeah, in my opinion, Jim is where the local government works with these things as well on a regular basis. Without moving the abatements, if you were to go about adjusting assessment methodologies and removing depreciation, changing the 35% of taxable value to 40%, whatever other things you think of, if the abatement is still there, your revenue is still constrained. So I do not know how you actually move the needle on the revenue without doing something with the abatements. I think that's key. And on the sales tax side, again, this is just a personal opinion, but it's sales tax base, it's not sales tax rate. That's where there is much more. And I offered you an explanation earlier that on the property tax side, that I think might have some intrigue about it. Taking the abatements and reducing the existing tax rates all proportionately down to the point where you have zero abatement, but you have a lower tax rate, produces the same amount of revenue, but it does create a big amount of headroom between what is otherwise maximum allowable, using local government terms, the maximum allowable ad valorem revenue or other limitations that are imposed upon the rate. A lot of the rural counties are at the 366 cap. There are some counties that are not, but a lot of them are. And that becomes a huge impediment. And it just seems to me that something that would have the feature of lowering property tax rates might be viewed as more positive as a beginning point. Then picking up that headroom, there'd be a lot of talk. How do you do that? Is it legislatively imposed? We're adding another 50 cents to the school rate, or does it provide the state the ability to go out to a ballot question? You know, all of that becomes more finessing around the, you know, the main concept. But yeah, in my opinion, if you don't move on the abatements, you don't pick up much on the property tax side. But you know, the other part of that, Dusty, that I think is important is the issue of abatements or depreciation or market value versus assessed value. That's not just an education issue. All the local governments in the state would have a stake and an interest in the outcome of that. You know, so there may be the opportunity to, you know, sort of gain a broader alliance around a, you know, an updating of our tax policy type of approach, right? Because some of the, you know, just like the Nevada plan was sort of a patchwork quilt built over a number of years. A lot of our tax policy in the state is exactly the same way. And we had property tax well before we had abatements. We had property tax before we had legislatively imposed limits on those property taxes. I'm actually old enough to remember those days and probably covered wagons and things like that too. But anything that is, you know, anything that was statutorily changed in the past to create these problems can be statutorily remedied. Maybe that's more of an answer than you were looking for, but.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Any other comments on this before we move the agenda? Seeing none, item number 9 is identification of future agenda items that members wish to discuss. I've taken a couple of notes here. Carlene told me this would be a real important thing to do, so I'm taking notes. We need some additional data on transportation and food service. The indexes or indices that would be used for inflating those. We left that to be brought back before us. We hope to have the EK APA results of their discussions as it relates to the NCEI, and hopefully finally be able to put that matter to bed. Hopefully their discussions will yield something that will be helpful. Methodology for new charter school provision of auxiliary services, method of computing the average, the item that we had previously, we identified things that need to come back to this commission. Paul mentioned the definition of ending fund balance. Certainly want to make sure that that's included and also finally put to bed. And probably most exciting next agenda would be selection of a vice chair, because that really comes with a lot of great benefits. So, you know, you can all start campaigning right now. But I think we need to go ahead and put that one to bed as well. And then I would turn to Heidi and ask if there's other items that they have on their punch list that we should also include.
Heidi Hartz, for the record, Chair Hobbs, I believe that your list mirrors the list that we have developed.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Anybody else? Did I leave anything out? Okay. Item number 10, public comment period number 2. Public comment will be taken during this agenda item on any matter within the commission's jurisdiction, control, or advisory power. No action may be taken. So we're now in our second public comment period. As a reminder, members of the public may provide comment by dialing in using the link on the meeting agenda or calling area code 312-584-2401 and using passcode 560554. When members of the public dial in using these methods, they'll be placed in the waiting room until public comment is opened. Alternatively, there is an email address that can be used, mvboarded@doe.mv.gov, and those comments will be read into the record. I'll turn it over to Jessica once again to read through any comments from any members of the public that have dialed in or emailed. Jessica?
We've not received any comment via email, and I do not see that we have anyone in the waiting room at this time.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So public comment period number 2 is closed. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's agenda. The time is 11:46. And unless there's any objection, we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you all again for your time and cooperation and contributions today. We really appreciate it.
All right, we'll stop the share. And I'm going to encourage you all to listen to the whole meeting. It was interesting as they do not address the needs of the youngest and the neediest children. And that's not what they see their charge as. They see their charge, and what it's been for years is how to share the federal dollars equally amongst all the people, the inhabitants. And I just don't understand how charter schools qualify for the same neglected and delinquent money, because it's a different kind of population. Well, until we meet again, y'all, this is Darlene Anderson saying like, subscribe, and follow me. And share, share, share.